Imagine the scene. Rome's Colosseum roars with tens of thousands of spectators. The afternoon sun lights the arena, where blood and sweat mix with the golden sand. The men expect to see the usual: armed gladiators, wild beasts, public executions. But that day, something different happens. From one of the corridors, instead of a muscular warrior, an unexpected figure appears, a woman with helmet, shield, and sword. The crowd holds its breath, incredulous. She is not a Thracian slave, nor a Murmillo, nor a Retiarius. She is a woman, and she has come to fight. For centuries, the image of the gladiator has been inseparable from the idea of manliness. The man turned beast, the warrior condemned to entertain the people at the cost of his life. Yet what few know is that there were also women who dared to enter the arena. Gladiatrices, rare, uncommon, but as real as the bouts emperors themselves witnessed. The amphitheater was not just a place of spectacle, it was a political space. The games, funded by emperors and elites, served to consolidate power, distract the people, and reinforce the idea that Rome was invincible, bred in circuses, as the Romans themselves said. The blood on the sand had symbolic value. It showed that Rome dominated men, animals, nature itself. And in that setting of brutality and control, the appearance of female fighters was all the more shocking. Unlike male gladiators, of whom we have abundant testimonies, inscriptions, and even commemorative tombs, information about gladiatrices is scarce. Barely a few mentions in ancient authors, some imperial decrees that tried to limit their participation, and above all, a relief found at Halicarnassus in present-day Turkey, depicting two female combatants named Amazon and Achillea. Both appear with weapons and light protection, poised to fight like any other gladiator. It is one of the clearest pieces of evidence that female gladiature existed and was not a mere myth or literary invention. But why do we know so little? The answer is simple: because they were an exception. Chroniclers, accustomed to recounting male exploits, mentioned them only as curiosities unworthy of serious attention. In a society where the ideal woman was the modest matron devoted to the home, the fact of seeing women fighting to the death in an amphitheater ran so counter to traditional values that many authors used it as an example of decadence and moral degeneration. Juvenal, the satirical poet of the 2nd century, wrote with scorn about women who trained with weapons. For him, it was a sign of corruption, of an empire that had lost its way. How could a Roman woman, destined to be mother and wife, expose herself to the public shame of the arena? His words described not so much the gladiatrices as the scandal they provoked in Rome's conservative circles. Dio Cassius, for his part, relates that the Emperor Domitian organized combats of gladiatrices at the games, and that he even had them fight at night by torchlight as part of an extravagant spectacle. These mentions remind us that, although rare, gladiatrices existed and were used as singular attractions to astonish the public. Even so, the fragmentary nature of the sources leaves us with more questions than answers. We know they were there, that some emperors promoted them and others tried to forbid them. We know they fought, that they were seen by thousands of eyes, yet we barely hear their voices. None of them left a written record. We are left only with the gazes of the men who watched them, fascinated or scandalized. And so we come to the real mystery. What was it like to live as a woman in a world built for blood in the arena, to be a man's affair? What did it mean to be a gladiatrix, knowing that the simple act of wielding a sword was already a transgression of everything society expected of you? The path that led a woman to the floor of the Colosseum was neither simple nor common. Unlike male gladiators, whose numbers ran into the thousands across the empire, the women who took up arms in an amphitheater were always exceptions, almost living curiosities. And yet, their very existence poses an inevitable question. How did they get there? The sources speak of several possible routes. The first, the most obvious in a slaveholding society like Rome, was slavery. Women captured in wars, sold in markets, or inherited by noble families could end up in the hands of a lanista, the gladiator impresario. For an owner of gladiators, training a woman was not the norm, but it was an attractive option when he wanted to offer the public something novel or please a sponsor. Another path was judicial sentence. Rome made public punishment into a spectacle. Criminals, debtors, or those who had offended the state could be sent to the arena as punishment. In the case of women, this fate was infrequent. but it is documented that some were exposed in shows as a form of chastisement. It was not only about punishing, but also publicly humiliating the person who had overstepped moral boundaries. The most surprising possibility, and the most scandalous to the Roman mind, was that of volunteers. There are testimonies of free women who, driven by ambition, poverty, or even the pursuit of notoriety, offered themselves to become gladiatrices. Unlike men, for whom volunteering could bring a certain prestige, in the female case, the gesture was seen as absolute degradation. In Rome's moral hierarchy, the woman who exposed herself in the arena stood on the same level as a prostitute or an actress, someone who had lost her honor and fallen into the condition of infamous. Infamy was more than a label, it was a legal status. Whoever was considered infamous lost fundamental rights, such as being able to testify in court, inherit normally, or marry legitimately. For a man, infamy already meant a social stain difficult to erase. For a woman, it was a total break with what society expected of her. Entering the arena meant renouncing the respectability of the Roman matron, the ideal of mother and guardian of the household. That is why, when a woman chose to be a gladiatrix, she crossed a threshold from which there was no return. We have concrete examples of such women. The best known is the relief found at Halicarnassus in Asia Minor, depicting two gladiatrices named Amazon and Achillea. The inscription accompanying them indicates that they fought bravely and were granted freedom after their bout, something reserved for those who had shown valor in the arena. This archaeological piece is one of the few tangible proofs of the existence of gladiatrices, and it reveals that at least some of them achieved enough renown to be immortalized in stone. The historian Dio Cassius also mentions in his chronicles that Emperor Domitian organized nighttime spectacles in which women fought, often combined with fights of dwarfs or animal combats. For Domitian, known for his taste for extravagance, these gladiatrices were not mere fighters, but a way to show that his power could turn even the most unusual into entertainment. Female presence in the arena was so controversial that emperors themselves tried to regulate it. Augustus, obsessed with restoring traditional customs, curbed excess luxury in the games and sought to restrict women's participation in them. Later, around the year 200 of our era, Septimius Severus went further and expressly banned female combats. The edict did not arise by chance. It means that up to that moment, they were still being organized, and that the controversy around gladiatrices was intense enough to require an official measure. Thus, we can sketch an uneven panorama. Some women were thrown into the arena as slaves or criminals. Others, driven by personal reasons, volunteered, even knowing that it meant the end of their social honor. And although emperors sometimes promoted them as extravagant spectacle, at other times they tried to eliminate them as a symptom of decadence. The story of the gladiatrices, in truth, speaks not only of fighting and spectacle. It speaks of the limits placed on women in Rome, of what society accepted and what it condemned, and it poses another unsettling question. What could impel a woman to renounce everything society expected of her in order to risk her life in the arena? The fate of every gladiatrix began in a place both dark and fascinating: the ludus, the gladiator school. These centers were spread throughout the Roman Empire, but the most famous stood in Rome near the Colosseum, such as the ludus magnus. There lived and trained the men destined to become the lifeblood of the spectacle. And although women's presence in these places was exceptional, we can imagine, based on testimonies and known practices, what their life inside those walls would have been like. The ludus was run by the lanista, an entrepreneur of dubious reputation. To the Romans, the lanista was almost a trafficker in human flesh. He bought, trained, and sold gladiators as if they were merchandise. But his role was crucial because without him, the spectacle would not have existed. A skilled lanista could form feared and valuable fighters and thus amass a fortune. In the case of gladiatrices, their rarity made them a high-impact resource. They could be trained as exotic curiosities, as pieces destined to draw the attention of the public and of patrons. Training was brutal. Every gladiator, and we can extend this to the few gladiatrices, had to learn not only to fight, but to endure. The arena demanded bodies capable of withstanding long days, blows, wounds, and the weight of armament. That is why in the first months, instruction focused on physical endurance, running while carrying weight, repetitive drills with wooden weapons heavier than the real ones, routines that strengthened arms and legs. Discipline was strict. Those who refused to train could receive corporal punishment, food deprivation, or confinement. An essential part of learning involved wooden weapons, called the rudis. With them, fighters practiced combat techniques without dying in training. The instructors, veteran-freed gladiators, taught stances, defenses, attacks, and repeated the sequences to the point of exhaustion. Everything had to be measured, because in the amphitheater, every mistake could be fatal. Another aspect that helps us understand life in the ludus is diet. Studies of gladiator bones found in excavations at Ephesus, in present-day Turkey, revealed that their food was based mainly on cereals, legumes, and plant products. In fact, they were nicknamed hordeari, the barley men. Unlike what we might imagine, they did not feast on great banquets of meat, but ate simple meals rich in carbohydrates. They also consumed a mixture of vegetable ash that, according to some texts, served to strengthen the bones. For a gladiatrix, this regimen would have been the same, because what mattered was not slenderness or aesthetics, but endurance and the capacity to absorb blows. Living conditions in the barracks were harsh. Small stone cells, rudimentary beds, little personal space. Life was marked by an internal hierarchy. At the top were veteran gladiators, some of whom enjoyed privileges and respect. At the bottom, newcomers, who suffered humiliations and stricter discipline. For a woman within this predominantly male environment, the situation must have been even more complex. The scarcity of testimonies forces us to infer from hints, but everything suggests that gladiatrices could be subjected to abuse or sexual exploitation, both by Lannistai and by powerful clients who paid for access to these human rarities. Their double condition, fighters and women in a world designed for male spectacle, inevitably made them objects of prurient curiosity as well. In this sense, comparison with the most famous gladiators is revealing. A man could, over time, achieve a prestige that transcended his servile condition. There were gladiators admired as popular heroes, their names were celebrated in graffiti, and some achieved enough fame to win freedom and become trainers or even figures of some note. A woman, by contrast, even if recognized in the arena, scarcely escaped scandal. Her fame did not become respect, but something far more ambiguous, a mix of attraction, curiosity, and moral condemnation. For all these reasons, the ludus was not only a school of combat, it was also a prison, a marketplace of bodies, and a place where daily life oscillated between military discipline and personal humiliation. For gladiatrices, every day there was a reminder that they were crossing an invisible border, the one separating the world of Roman matrons with their private, respectable lives from the world of the infamous, exposed and used to entertain a multitude that celebrated skill as much as blood. In those dark barracks, amid sweat, ash, and wounds, the women who would one day enter the arena of the Colosseum were forged, and although their numbers were small, their mere presence defied everything Rome considered natural. If male gladiators were the blood and sinew of the Roman Empire, gladiatrices were something far stranger, an exception turned spectacle. Their appearances in the arena were not part of everyday entertainment. They were rather carefully staged rarities designed to provoke surprise, scandal, and conversation. Where the custom of male combat stirred admiration and ritualized violence, the presence of an armed woman introduced a note of exoticism that both fascinated and unsettled. The difference from regular bouts was obvious. Male gladiators fought according to codified matchups, Murmillos against Retiarii, Secutores against Thracians, duels the public knew well and awaited with excitement. In the case of gladiatrices, the goal was not to uphold the tradition of combat, but to break it. They were displayed as rarities, as living curiosities that turned the arena into a stage for the improbable. The woman who wielded a sword or a trident was not there to embody the glory of Mars, but to show that even the unthinkable could happen under the emperor's authority. It is no accident that such spectacles tended to appear at special celebrations. The Roman games, known as ludi or munera, were organized by magistrates or emperors and had a strong political component. The grander and more surprising the spectacle, the more prestige the organizer gained. In this context, Introducing gladiatrices into the arena was a way to display power and wealth, an extravagant luxury capable of leaving everyone open-mouthed. Suetonius, biographer of the emperors, describes how Domitian, a ruler of the late 1st century, organized nighttime combats in which women and dwarfs participated. The intention was clear: to offer a spectacle no one would forget. Fights by torchlight, illuminated by fire, turned the arena into a theater of shadows where the figure of an armed woman became even more astonishing. What may sound to us like prurient exploitation was then celebrated as a demonstration of imperial power. Only an emperor could turn into entertainment what society considered unthinkable. The most compelling proof of these fighters' existence lies not only in texts, but also in archaeology. The relief from Halicarnassus, found in present-day Turkey, shows 2 gladiatrices facing off, Amazon and Achillea. Their names evoke the mythical warrior women of Greek tradition, and that is no coincidence. The Roman imagination associated them with the Amazons, symbols of the exotic and of the inversion of natural roles. The inscription accompanying the relief states that both fought bravely and were dismissed with honor. This unique piece reveals not only that gladiatrices existed, but that some achieved sufficient importance to be remembered in stone. The combat formats in which they could participate were varied. Some testimonies suggest they fought one another, direct contests that set 2 women against each other for the crowd's delight. It has also been proposed that they took part in spectacles with animals, though probably against lesser prey, beasts not too dangerous, because the aim was not so much carnage as visual impact. And on occasion, they might have formed part of mixed bouts, facing men in fights designed precisely to highlight the improbability of the scene. Audience reception was ambivalent. On the one hand, it is evident that they stirred enthusiasm. The titillation of seeing an armed woman, sweating and fighting, was irresistible to a society used to thinking of women as discreet matrons or silent slaves. Novelty was a magnet. On the other hand, the very rarity that aroused curiosity also fed criticism. Writers like Juvenal mocked women who trained in gymnasia, seeing them as a symbol of Rome's moral decline. For him and other moralists, gladiatrices were not brave fighters, but proof that society had lost its natural balance. This contrast between attraction and rejection is key to understanding the phenomenon. The spectacle of gladiatrices played precisely with that tension. Seeing armed women was an act of cultural transgression. It represented an inversion of the established order and therefore provoked so much prurient interest. Those who attended these combats were not only watching a duel, but a symbolic rupture of social norms, and they did so with a mix of fascination and repulsion, knowing that once the show ended, everything would return to normal. In short, female combats in the arena were less frequent, but more charged with meaning than male ones. They were not simple fights. They were spectacles designed to provoke, to display the emperor's power, and to explore, however pruriently, the limits of what Rome considered possible. And although moralists condemned them, their memory persists precisely because they challenged the gender and honor categories that sustained Roman society. To grasp what it meant to see a woman fight in the Roman arena, we must pause over the era's moral framework. In Roman thinking, the ideal woman was not the one who stood out in public, but the one who remained within the bounds of the private sphere. The figure of the matron was the quintessential feminine ideal, modest, sober, guardian of the home and of family virtue. Her role was to be a faithful wife, mother of legitimate children, and manager of the domestic realm. Against that image, the gladiatrix was the exact opposite. Armed, sweaty, exposed to the gaze of thousands of spectators, these women not only left the private sphere, but did so in the most radical way possible, by surrendering their bodies to the spectacle of violence. In the terms of Roman society, it was an absolute transgression. The arena was a territory of blood, pain, and masculine spectacle. That a woman crossed that threshold meant, to many, that she had abandoned the path of virtue and fallen into the world of infamy. Infamy in Rome was a legal and moral category. Gladiators, actors, prostitutes, and certain entertainment-related trades were considered infamous. This status entailed loss of honor and of rights. They could not testify in court or hold public office. Their marriage lacked legal recognition, and their word carried little weight in civic life. For a man, it was already a severe stigma. For a woman, the impact was even more devastating because it destroyed at the root the image of purity and respect on which her social value was built. Writers of the time did not spare criticism of the phenomenon. Juvenal, one of Rome's most biting satirists, ridiculed in his satires the women who practiced with weapons, describing them as grotesque and ridiculous. To him, they were not brave fighters, but symbols of a decadent society where women had lost their modesty and men their manliness. Juvenal mocked them training with helmet and sword as if they were men, while underscoring that their boldness was a sign of a Rome straying from its ancient virtues. Yet this moral condemnation coexisted with obvious fascination. For although despised, gladiatrices drew crowds. They were a curiosity that sparked conversation, a prurient topic that captivated as much as it scandalized. The Halicarnassus relief shows that they could even be honored with monuments, though probably more for their rarity than for full recognition as honorable. In this sense, we can speak of a kind of marginal celebrity, women who, at the cost of losing their place in respectable society, became figures people discussed, remembered, and sought out. This ambiguous status was not exclusive to gladiatrices. Rome knew other women who, by breaking the matronly mold, were trapped in a degraded yet desired social position. Actresses and dancers, for instance, were officially infamous without access to public respect. Yet many were protected and courted by the elite, who in private indulged in what they condemned in public. Prostitutes, at an even lower level, shared this paradox. Their trade was despised, but it was also indispensable and sought after, even by men of the highest power. Gladiatrices, in this sense, shared that double condition. To moralists, they represented the corruption of customs. To the public, they were an irresistible spectacle. For some, they might even awaken a kind of admiration, women who had renounced everything expected of them to face danger. But that admiration rarely translated into true respect. It was a mixture of prurience, attraction, and mockery. The contrast with the matron is revealing. While the Roman wife was praised for her silence, modesty, and public invisibility, the gladiatrix was the opposite, loud, visible, turned into spectacle. That is why her presence in the arena was so disturbing. She was not only fighting another gladiator, she was fighting the entire weight of Roman morality. Here we can see the great contradiction of the empire. Rome could harbor within itself both the Vestals, sacred virgins with an aura of sanctity, and gladiatrices, women who gave their bodies to bloody entertainment. Between those extremes, society moved, oscillating between veneration of the pure and fascination with the forbidden. Thus, the social stigma of gladiatrices tells us more about Rome than about the women themselves. Because in the end, what scandalized people was not so much the fact that they fought, but what they symbolized, the rupture of the gender hierarchies that underpinned Roman identity. And in that tension, between contempt and prurience, between mockery and fascination, the brief and contradictory history of these women of the arena was forged. The brief and contentious phenomenon of gladiatrices could not last long in an empire obsessed with order and morality. Although some emperors, like Domitian, favored their presence as part of extravagant spectacles, others began to see in them a danger to Rome's image. And it was in this context that, around the year 200 after Christ, Emperor Septimius Severus issued a decisive edict. Female gladiatorial combats were banned. Why did an emperor who had tolerated and even organized all manner of bloody spectacles decide to end female participation? The reasons were multiple. On the one hand was traditional morality. In times of crisis, Rome sought to reaffirm the values it considered pillars of its identity. Among them was the ideal of woman as wife, mother, and guardian of the home. A woman who wielded a weapon before thousands of spectators was, for many, a symbolic threat. On the other hand, female combats were seen as excesses of luxury and extravagance. Organizing spectacles with gladiatrices was not cheap. It required training, care, and above all was considered a caprice intended to impress the crowd with rarities. At a time when the empire faced growing military and economic difficulties, excesses were less and less tolerated. Septimius Severus, pragmatic and aware of the need to maintain an image of authority and discipline, decided to put an end to them. The ban did not mean immediate disappearance, but it did mark the beginning of the end. With the imperial edict, official organization of female combats ceased. It is possible that in some out-of-the-way places or private shows, female fights still occurred for a time, but marginally and in rapid decline. From the 3rd century onward, women's presence in the arena became a memory, an echo of the extravagant days of the High Empire. But this fate was not exclusive to gladiatrices. The gladiatorial games themselves began to decline. From the mid-3rd century, Rome lived through turbulent times. Economic crises, invasions, epidemics, and civil wars undermined the empire's stability. Maintaining the lavish games, with their enormous logistical and human cost, became ever more difficult. At the same time, Christianity emerged as a cultural and religious force that condemned amphitheater violence, eroding the social consensus that had sustained the games for centuries. The result was that, by the 5th century, gladiatorial combats disappeared completely. The Colosseum and other amphitheaters were left as silent ruins of a time when blood was Rome's favorite spectacle. And with them, gladiatrices were buried in oblivion, reduced to a few mentions in ancient texts and to a relief at Halicarnassus that reminds us they once existed. Even so, their legacy goes beyond the scant material traces. Gladiatrices force us to rethink our view of the Roman world, and in particular, of women's roles within it. Although they were a minority, their very existence shows that even in a rigid society marked by deeply rooted gender roles, there were women who crossed every social boundary to occupy a place in Rome's most masculine and brutal space, the arena. They were infamous, despised by many, secretly celebrated by others, turned into rarities for a spectacle that devoured any novelty. And yet, they were there. Their history speaks to us of the limits of female transgression in Rome, but also of the fascination aroused by watching those limits break. The image the Halicarnassus relief leaves us is powerful. 2 women, named Amazon and Achillea, armed with sword and shield, facing each other in combat. Perhaps they were never famous or acclaimed like the most celebrated male gladiators. Perhaps their memory quickly faded from collective remembrance, but their figure sums up, in a single gesture, the paradox of Rome. A civilization capable of turning everything into spectacle, even the fighting of women who, by their very presence, defied the deepest norms of their society. When we think of gladiatrices, we should not imagine them as a mass phenomenon or as heroines free of their time. They were part of a cruel system designed to entertain at the expense of their own suffering. But neither should we ignore them, because their existence, however marginal, reminds us that history is full of dislocations, of lives that strayed from the script written for them. And those exceptions are often the ones that most clearly reveal a culture's tensions and contradictions. Thus, the story of the gladiatrices closes in silence, banned and forgotten by the very empire that created them. But their shadow remains. In the arena of the Colosseum, amid echoes of roars muffled by the centuries, we can still imagine the clash of 2 swords wielded by women, an image that challenges, that unsettles, and that fascinates. An image that forces us to recognize that Rome, in its splendor and in its decadence, left no space unexplored in its insatiable need for spectacle. And perhaps, in that final image, the 2 gladiatrices facing each other under the sun of an amphitheater, we can sum up the very essence of the empire: greatness and brutality, order and transgression, power and spectacle, all turned into sand, all turned into play, even the lives and the blood of those women who, against all odds, dared to be gladiatrices.